In March of 2003, four retired friends vanished without a trace after what should have been the most fortunate night of their lives. Nancy Kellerman, Bernice Watson, Lorna Phillips, and Jean Morrison had shared decades of friendship, weekly coffee, dates, and countless evenings at Silver Ridge Casino's bingo hall. But after celebrating a substantial jackpot win in the early morning hours of March 15th, they simply disappeared into the Kansas prairie darkness, leaving behind only an abandoned vehicle and a mystery that would haunt their families for years. 7 years later, a discovery buried deep within the casino's forgotten security archives would finally reveal the shocking truth about what happened to these four women and the disturbing lengths some people will go to for money. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story begins on what seemed like an ordinary Thursday evening. Nancy Kellerman, 72 and recently widowed, had been looking forward to bingo night all week. Since her husband Harold's death 6 months earlier, these weekly outings with her three closest friends had become her anchor to normalcy. Bernice Watson, 68 and sharp as ever despite her arthritis, picked up Nancy in her burgundy Buick LeSabre at precisely 6:30, just as she had every Thursday for the past 3 years. Their next stop was Lorna Phillips, 71, a former elementary school teacher whose meticulous nature made her the group's unofficial organizer. Finally, they collected Jean Morrison, 69, whose infectious laugh and optimistic outlook had carried the group through Harold's funeral and countless other challenges over the decades. The Silver Ridge Casino sat like a glittering island in the vast expanse of rural Kansas, its neon signs cutting through the prairie darkness for miles. Built in 1998 on tribal land, the casino had quickly become a regional destination, drawing visitors from across the Midwest with promises of fortune and excitement. The bingo hall occupied the casino's east wing, a cavernous space filled with long tables, electronic doorbells, and the comfortable chatter of regular players who knew each other's patterns and superstitions. Nancy, Bernice, Lorna, and Jean had claimed their usual spots at table 7, positioned perfectly to see the electronic boards while maintaining their tradition of sharing snacks and gentle gossip between games. They were known regulars, the kind of players the staff recognized and genuinely liked. Nancy always ordered the same Diet Coke with extra ice. Bernice brought homemade cookies to share with neighboring tables. Lorna kept meticulous records of their wins and losses in a small spiral notebook. Jean inevitably struck up conversations with newcomers, making them feel welcome in what could otherwise be an intimidating environment. That particular Thursday evening started like any other. The friends arrived at 7, secured their favorite table, and settled in for what they expected to be a pleasant but unremarkable night. The bingo hall was moderately busy, perhaps 60 players scattered across the tables, a typical crowd. For a weeknight session, the caller, a jovial man named Mike Peterson, who had worked the Thursday shift for 5 years, recognized the four women immediately and gave them his customary wave. The evening progressed through the usual rhythm of regular games, with modest payouts of $20 or $30 going to various winners. Nancy won $45 on Game 7, enough to cover her evening's card purchases with a little extra. Bernice hit a small jackpot of $87 during the 10th game, money she immediately announced would go toward her granddaughter's birthday present. The mood at table 7 was light and companionable, exactly what these four friends had come to treasure about their weekly tradition. Everything changed during the evening's final session, the progressive jackpot game that had been building. For 3 weeks, the prize had reached $7,822, a substantial sum that had drawn larger crowds in recent weeks as word spread through the community. Progressive jackpots required a special card purchase and followed different rules, with winners needing to achieve bingo within a specific number of calls to claim the full amount. Lorna, ever practical, had suggested they pool their money to buy additional cards for the progressive game, increasing their chances while sharing any potential winnings equally. Nancy, Bernice, and Jean readily agreed. They purchased 12 cards total, 3 for each woman, at $5 per card. The investment represented their biggest gambling risk in months, but the potential reward and the thrill of playing together made it feel like a celebration rather than a gamble. The progressive game began at 11:47 p.m., according to casino records, that would later be scrutinized by investigators. Mike Peterson's voice carried across the hall with heightened energy as he announced the prize amount and the rules for winning. The required pattern was a full card blackout, all 24, numbers plus the free space within 65 calls. The mathematical odds were substantial, but not impossible, especially with 12 cards in play. The numbers came steadily: B7, I19, N32, G52. Nancy dabbed her cards with the focused intensity she had once brought to balancing her household. Budget? Bernice squinted at her numbers through reading glasses, occasionally asking Lorna to double-check a square. Jean maintained a running commentary of encouragement, her voice a gentle counterpoint to Mike Peterson's official announcements. As the called numbers mounted, the tension in the hall became palpable. Several players were clearly close to achieving the winning pattern, their cards nearly full with only a few numbers remaining. At table 7, Jean suddenly gripped Nancy's arm. One of her cards needed only 2 more numbers, I-24 and G-59. Mike Peterson's voice rang out, I-24. Jean's sharp intake of breath was audible 3 tables away. She needed only G-59, G-59. The word bingo erupted from table 7 with such force that the entire hall fell silent. Jean Morrison, the woman who had taught Sunday school for 40 years and never raised her voice above gentle correction, was on her feet with her arms raised in triumph. Her 3 friends immediately surrounded her, their excitement genuine and infectious. Other players turned to applaud, caught up in the moment's joy despite their own disappointment. Mike Peterson verified the winning card with ceremony befitting the moment. The progressive jackpot of $7,540 belonged to Jean Morrison, or more accurately, to the 4 friends who had agreed to split any winnings equally. After taxes and the casino's processing fee, they would take home approximately $6,100, or roughly $1,125 each. For 4 women living on fixed incomes, this represented a significant windfall, enough to cover several months of expenses or perhaps fund small luxuries they had been denying themselves. The payout process took nearly an hour. Casino protocol required extensive verification for jackpots over $5,000, including additional identification checks and tax documentation. A casino manager named Robert Chen handled the paperwork personally, congratulating the women on their good fortune while ensuring all regulations were properly followed. The 4 friends waited patiently, their excitement barely contained, as they discussed how they might use their unexpected windfall. Nancy spoke quietly about finally replacing her old washing machine, which had been making concerning noises for months. Bernice mentioned a trip to visit her sister in Colorado, something she had been postponing due to cost. Lorna thought about contributing to her church's building fund, a cause she had supported modestly for years. Jean, ever generous, immediately began planning gifts for her grandchildren and wondered if she might finally be able to help her daughter with some pressing medical bills. The payout was completed at 2:31 a.m. according to casino records. Robert Chen handed Jean a sealed envelope containing the cash, minus the portion withheld for taxes. He also provided each woman with appropriate tax documentation and congratulated them once more on their remarkable good fortune. security protocols required that winners of substantial jackpots be escorted to their vehicles, but the four friends politely declined the offer, as was their right. Casino security cameras recorded the four women leaving through the main entrance at 2:34 a.m. They moved slowly, their age and the late hour taking a toll, but their spirits remained high. Nancy carried her small purse and a plastic bag containing the evening's leftover cookies. Bernice had her usual oversized handbag and was wearing the light blue cardigan she favored for air-conditioned environments. Lorna clutched her spiral, notebook, and a casino-provided plastic bag containing their tax paperwork. Jun held the payout envelope carefully in both hands, as if it might disappear if she loosened her grip. The parking lot was largely empty at that hour, with perhaps 20 vehicles scattered across a space designed for several hundred cars. Bernice's burgundy Buick sat under a security light approximately 50 yards from the main entrance. The women walked together, their conversation animated despite the fatigue that was beginning to show in their movements. At 2:37 a.m., security cameras captured the four friends reaching Bernice's vehicle. The footage shows them standing beside the car for several minutes, continuing their excited discussion of the evening's events. Lorna can be seen consulting her notebook, possibly calculating exact distributions of their winnings. Jung appears to open the payout envelope briefly, perhaps confirming its contents one final time. At 2:41 a.m., all four women enter the Buick, with Bernice in the driver's seat as always. The engine starts, the headlights activate, and the vehicle begins moving toward the parking lot exit. This would be the last verified sighting of Nancy Kellerman, Bernice Watson, Lorna Phillips, and Jean Morrison alive. The drive from Silver Ridge Casino to Nancy's house, where Bernice typically dropped her off first, should have taken approximately 12 minutes along rural highways that were virtually deserted at that hour. Bernice knew the route intimately, having driven it countless times over the past 3 years. The road was straight, well-maintained, and presented no particular hazards even in darkness. When Nancy's daughter Martha arrived at her mother's house at 7:30 a.m. to drive her to a medical appointment, she found no sign that Nancy had returned home. The porch light was still on, exactly as Nancy always left it when going out for the evening. The morning newspaper lay untouched on the front steps. Most telling, Nancy's small white cat Princess was crying frantically at the back door, clearly having been outside all night, despite Nancy's absolute routine of bringing her in before bedtime. Martha's initial concern quickly escalated to alarm. She called Bernice's house, but there was no answer. Calls to Lorna and Jean's homes produced the same troubling result. By 9 a.m., Martha had contacted all four families, confirming that none of the women had returned home from their bingo evening. The missing persons report was filed at 10:15 a.m. by Jean's son-in-law, David Cooper, who worked as a deputy sheriff in an adjacent county. His law enforcement experience told him that 4 elderly women disappearing simultaneously was not a matter that could wait for the standard 24-hour period before official action. Sheriff Tom Brennan of Riley County recognized the gravity of the situation immediately and authorized a comprehensive search effort within hours of the initial report. The search began with the most likely scenario, a traffic accident somewhere. Along the route between the casino and the women's homes, deputies drove every possible path the group might have taken, checking roadside ditches and examining any evidence of vehicles leaving the pavement. The spring weather had been mild, with no rain or unusual conditions that might have contributed to an accident. At 2:17 p.m., nearly 12 hours after the women were last seen, Deputy Sarah Martinez made the discovery that would transform missing persons case into something far more sinister. Approximately 3 miles from Silver Ridge Casino, along a rural access road that paralleled the main highway, She found Bernice Watson's burgundy Buick LeSabre sitting abandoned in a small gravel turnout used occasionally by farm equipment. Vehicle's condition immediately suggested this was not a simple breakdown or accident. The engine was still running, despite having been unattended for nearly 12 hours. The driver's side door was open, but not fully, as if someone had gotten out quickly without taking time to close it properly. The headlights were still on, their beams cutting through the afternoon sunlight in a ghostly reminder of the previous night's darkness. Inside the vehicle, investigators found clear evidence of the women's presence and their evening's activities. Nancy's small purse sat on the front passenger seat, her wallet still containing her identification and $43 in cash. Bernice's oversized handbag was on the floor behind the driver's seat, its contents undisturbed. Lorna's spiral notebook lay open on the back seat, showing her careful record of the evening's games. Most significantly, Jean's tax documentation from the casino payout was scattered across the back seat, as if dropped hastily. What investigators did not find was equally telling. There was no sign of the payout envelope containing over $6,000 in cash. There was no evidence of the women themselves, not so much as a scrap of clothing or a dropped item that might indicate their direction of travel. Most disturbing, there were no obvious signs of struggle within the vehicle, no blood or evidence of violence that might explain their disappearance. The crime scene team spent 4 hours documenting every detail of the abandoned Buick and its surroundings. They photographed the vehicle from every angle, catalogued its contents, and processed potential evidence including fingerprints, hair samples, and any trace materials that might provide clues. The gravel turnout showed tire tracks from multiple vehicles, but the loose surface made it impossible to determine which marks were recent or relevant to the case. Sheriff Brennan established a command post at the Riley County Sheriff's Office and began coordinating what would become one of the most extensive missing persons investigations in the county's history. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation was contacted and agreed to provide additional resources. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was notified due to the possibility that the case might involve kidnapping across state lines, though no ransom demands had been received. The initial investigation focused on several possible scenarios. The most optimistic theory suggested that the women had experienced some kind of medical emergency, perhaps with Bernice becoming unable to drive, and had been taken to a hospital by Good Samaritans who had not yet been identified. This possibility led to calls to every medical facility within a 100-mile radius, but no elderly women matching their descriptions had been admitted. A more troubling theory involved criminal activity specifically targeting the casino winners. The substantial cash payout made robbery a clear motive, and investigators began examining whether the women had been followed from the casino by someone aware of their winnings. This line of investigation would prove both promising and frustrating, as the casino's cooperation would be less complete than families had hoped. Robert Chen, the casino manager who had processed the payout, was interviewed extensively about the evening's events. He confirmed the timeline and payout amount, emphasizing that casino protocol had been followed precisely. When asked about security measures for winners, Chen explained that escorts were offered but could not be forced on patrons who declined. He seemed genuinely distressed by the women's disappearance and offered the casino's full cooperation with the investigation. However, when investigators requested access to all security camera footage from the evening, they encountered the first of several obstacles that would plague the case. The casino's security director, a former police officer named Marcus Webb, explained that their camera system was complex and that retrieving footage required coordination with their corporate headquarters. While they could provide footage from public areas, like the bingo hall and main entrance, cameras covering the parking lot and perimeter areas were part of a different system that would take time to access. The footage that was immediately available showed the four women's evening at the casino exactly as witnesses had described. The cameras captured their arrival, their time in the bingo hall, Jean's jackpot celebration, and the payout process. The final images showed them walking toward the parking lot, animated and clearly in good spirits. But the crucial footage of what might have happened in the parking lot itself remained tantalizingly out of reach, as the casino claimed technical difficulties with their external security system. Days stretched into weeks as the investigation expanded in every direction. Hundreds of volunteers joined organized searches covering thousands of acres of prairie and farmland surrounding the area where the Buick was found. Aircraft from the Kansas National Guard flew grid patterns searching for any sign of the missing women. Dive teams checked farm ponds and creek beds. The response from the community was overwhelming, with people taking time off work and traveling from other counties to assist in the search effort. Media coverage of the case was extensive, with regional television stations and newspapers featuring the story prominently. The four women's photographs appeared on missing persons flyers distributed throughout the Midwest. A reward fund established by their families grew to over $20,000 as local businesses and concerned citizens contributed. Yet despite all the attention and effort, no credible leads emerged. The investigation revealed that Nancy, Bernice, Lorna, and Jean had been creatures of habit, whose routines were well known to their families and friends. None had any history of mental health issues that might explain voluntary disappearance. None had financial problems that might motivate them to stage their own disappearance. None had any known enemies or involvement in activities that might attract criminal attention. They were, by all accounts, exactly what they appeared to be: four elderly friends who enjoyed each other's company and modest gambling entertainment. As the case entered its second month, investigators began exploring more complex theories. The possibility of human trafficking was considered, though the victim's age made this scenario unlikely. The potential for a serial killer was examined, though no similar cases had been reported in the region. The chance that the women had encountered a random crime of opportunity remained possible, but the specific targeting of casino winners suggested something more deliberate. The casino security footage remained a source of frustration. While some parking lot cameras were eventually made available, technical problems had apparently corrupted much of the crucial footage from the night in question. What investigators received was fragmentary and often of poor quality, showing shadows and indistinct shapes that could not be definitively identified. The casino's insurance company became involved, claiming that water damage to their server room had compromised several drives containing security data. Family members grew increasingly frustrated with what they perceived as the casino's lack of cooperation. Martha Kellerman, Nancy's daughter, organized meetings with other family members to discuss hiring private investigators. Jean's son-in-law, David Cooper, used his law enforcement connections to pressure higher authorities to maintain focus on the case. But as months passed without any breakthrough, media attention began to fade, and resources were necessarily diverted to newer cases. The first anniversary of the disappearance brought renewed attention and a fresh appeal for information. Sheriff's deputies retraced every step of the investigation, re-interviewed witnesses, and sent evidence for additional testing using improved laboratory techniques. The reward fund was increased, and age-progressed sketches were prepared showing how the women might look after a year in captivity. Still, no meaningful leads emerged. By the second anniversary, the case had officially gone cold. The active investigation was scaled back to a single detective who reviewed tips and followed up on any new information, but the intensive search efforts had ended. Family members continued their own efforts, maintaining websites and social media pages dedicated to keeping the case in public awareness. They organized annual memorial services that also served as appeals for information. but hope was gradually giving way to the awful acceptance that they might never know what happened to their loved ones. The third, fourth, and fifth anniversaries passed with diminishing attention. Local newspapers might run a brief anniversary story, and family members would make their annual appeals. But the case had largely faded from public consciousness. The families' lives necessarily moved forward, even as part of their hearts remained frozen in that March night when 4 friends had simply vanished. The 6th anniversary brought an unexpected development, though one that initially seemed to lead nowhere. Silver Ridge Casino announced it was closing permanently, a victim of increased competition from newer gambling facilities and changing economic conditions. The closure process would take several months, during which time, equipment and records would be sorted, sold, or disposed of, according to various legal requirements. Marcus Webb, the former security director, had left the casino 2 years earlier to start his own private security consulting business. He learned of the casino's closure through industry contacts and realized that the investigation into the 4 missing women had never been fully resolved. While he had cooperated with authorities during the active investigation, he also knew that some security records had been difficult to access due to the complex corporate structure of casino ownership. Webb made contact with Sheriff Brennan, who by this time had been re-elected twice and was nearing retirement himself. They discussed whether the casino's closure might provide an opportunity to access security records that had previously been unavailable. Webb volunteered to coordinate with the closure process managers to ensure that any potentially relevant materials were preserved rather than destroyed. The 7th anniversary of the disappearance came and went without fanfare. But 3 months later, Sheriff Brennan received a phone call that would finally break the case wide open. Marcus Webb had been working with a crew dismantling the casino's security infrastructure when they discovered something significant in a storage room that had been overlooked during the initial closure inventory. Jerry Hoffman, a former security technician who had worked at Silver Ridge Casino for its entire operational life, had been hired to help with the technical aspects of the security system dismantling. Hoffman was a meticulous man who took pride in properly archiving electronic systems rather than simply discarding them. As he worked through boxes of backup drives and storage devices, he found several unmarked drives that appeared to contain security footage from various periods of the casino's operation. Most of the unmarked drives contained routine footage of no particular significance, but one drive, labeled only with a date that corresponded to March 2003, contained files that had been corrupted by water damage during the server room incident years earlier. Hoffman, whose technical skills exceeded those of the casino's regular IT staff, was able to recover portions of the damaged files using specialized software he had acquired for his personal consulting work. What Hoffman recovered would change everything. Among the fragmentary files were several minutes of clear footage from a parking lot camera that had supposedly been non-functional on the night the 4 women disappeared. The footage showed areas of the parking lot that had never been available to investigators, including the section where Bernice Watson's Buick had been parked. The timestamp on the recovered footage showed 2:45 a.m., just minutes after the 4 women had been seen entering their vehicle. The image quality was excellent, far superior to the degraded footage that had been provided to investigators years earlier. And what it showed was absolutely chilling. 2 men, both wearing dark clothing and baseball caps pulled low over their faces, could be seen moving purposefully through the parking lot. They were not walking randomly or casually, but appeared to be following a specific path that would intersect with the burgundy Buick. One man was noticeably taller than the other, with a distinctive gait that suggested possible military or law enforcement training. The shorter man carried what appeared to be a small duffel bag. The footage showed the two men approaching the Buick from behind as the four women were getting into the vehicle. The men split up, with the taller man moving to the driver's side, while the shorter man positioned himself on the passenger side. Both men appeared to be wearing gloves and moved with the coordination of individuals who had planned their actions in advance. What happened next was partially obscured by the vehicle itself, but the implications were unmistakable. The men appeared to confront the women almost immediately after they had gotten into the car. There were no signs of prolonged negotiation or conversation. Within less than 2 minutes, the footage showed all four women getting out of the vehicle and walking with the two men toward the edge of the parking lot, where the camera's range ended. The recovered footage was immediately turned over to law enforcement and sent to FBI laboratories for detailed analysis. Video enhancement techniques revealed additional details that hadn't been visible in the original viewing. The shorter man's face was briefly visible when he looked directly toward the camera, apparently unaware of its presence. While the image was not clear enough for immediate identification, it provided facial structure details that could be compared against potential suspects. More significantly, the enhanced footage revealed that the shorter man was wearing what appeared to be a Silver Ridge Casino employee shirt under his dark jacket. The casino's logo was partially visible when his jacket opened during movement. This detail suggested that at least one of the perpetrators had inside knowledge of the casino's operations and possibly its security systems. The investigation was immediately reopened with renewed energy and resources. The FBI took primary jurisdiction, bringing in specialized teams for video analysis, behavioral profiling, and database searches for similar crimes. The families were notified of the discovery and provided with carefully edited portions of the footage that confirmed their worst fears while sparing them the most traumatic details. Sheriff Brennan, now just months from retirement, threw himself into the renewed investigation with the determination of someone who had never forgotten the 4 missing women. The footage provided the first concrete evidence of criminal activity and offered several promising avenues for investigation. The casino employee angle was pursued aggressively. Employment records were subpoenaed, and every person who had worked at Silver Ridge Casino during March 2003 was identified and located for interview. The process was complicated by the fact that many former employees had moved away or changed careers in the 7 years since the women's disappearance. Robert Chen, the manager who had processed the jackpot payout, was re-interviewed extensively. He maintained that he had followed all proper procedures and had no knowledge of any conspiracy to target jackpot winners. However, investigators now focused on who might have known about the substantial cash payout and the women's plans to leave the casino. The breakthrough came when investigators interviewed Tommy Valdez, a former security guard who had left the casino just 2 months after the women's disappearance. Valdez, now working construction in Denver, initially claimed he remembered nothing unusual about that period. But when confronted with the enhanced footage and told that federal charges were being considered, his story began to change. Valdez admitted that he had been struggling with gambling debts in early 2003 and had been desperate for money. He confirmed that casino employees sometimes knew when large jackpots were won and by whom, information that could theoretically be used for criminal purposes. But he insisted he had never acted on such information and had no direct knowledge of what happened to the 4 women. However, Valdez provided a crucial piece of the puzzle when he mentioned his cousin, Miguel Santos, who had occasionally helped with security duties despite not being an official employee. Santos had military experience and, according to Valdez, had sometimes talked about how easy it would be to rob casino patrons who were carrying large amounts of cash. FBI agents located Miguel Santos in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he had been living under an assumed name and working various construction jobs. When confronted with the recovered footage and his cousin's statements, Santos initially denied any involvement. But when investigators mentioned that they had identified him through facial recognition analysis of the enhanced video, his composure cracked. Santos confessed to planning and executing the robbery of the 4 bingo winners, though he insisted that murder had never been part of the plan. According to his statement, he and an accomplice had followed the women from the casino with the intention of robbing them of their winnings and letting them go. The plan had gone wrong when the women had seen their faces and could identify them. The confession led investigators to a remote area approximately 30 miles from where the abandoned Buick had been found. Santos provided detailed directions to a location where, he claimed, the evidence of what had happened that night could be found. The search teams that had covered thousands of acres in the weeks after the disappearance had not reached this particular area, which was on private land posted against trespassing. On a cold November morning, 7 years and 8 months after 4 friends had celebrated the biggest jackpot win of their lives, investigators found what remained of Nancy Kellerman, Bernice Watson, Lorna Phillips, and Jean Morrison. They had been buried in shallow graves in a small clearing surrounded by dense woodland, far from any roads or buildings where their cries for help might have been heard. The medical examiner's report confirmed that all 4 women had died from gunshot wounds, apparently executed after being forced to reveal the location of their casino winnings. The payout envelope was never recovered, presumably spent by the perpetrators years earlier. Personal effects found at the scene confirmed the victims' identities and provided additional evidence linking Santos to the crime. Santos was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping and armed robbery. His accomplice, identified through Santos's confession as a drifter named Carl Hendricks, had died in an unrelated crime 3 years after the murders. The case would never go to trial, as Santos accepted a plea agreement in exchange for providing details about what had happened during the women's final hours. The families finally had the closure they had sought for nearly 8 years, though the truth brought its own form of anguish. The 4 friends had died because they had been in the wrong place with too much cash, targeted by men who saw them as easy victims. There had been no elaborate conspiracy, no complex criminal organization, just greed, opportunity, and a willingness to kill for money. Nancy Kellerman was buried next to her husband Harold in the cemetery where she had visited his grave every Sunday for 6 months before her own death. Bernice Watson was laid to rest in the plot she had purchased years earlier, next to the space reserved for her own husband, who would join her 4 years later. Lorna Phillips was buried in the churchyard where she had taught Sunday school and organized countless community events. Jean Morrison was interred in a family plot that now included 3 generations, her grave marked with flowers that her grandchildren would bring every birthday. The Silver Ridge casino property was eventually sold to developers who built a strip, mall and gas station on the site. A small memorial plaque, barely visible from the parking lot, marks the approximate location where 4 friends shared their last moment of joy together. Few people notice it, and fewer still understand its significance. Sheriff Tom Brennan retired 6 months after the case was closed, his final major investigation providing the resolution that had eluded him for nearly a decade. He never forgot the 4 women whose disappearance had haunted his dreams and whose families had trusted him to find answers. At his retirement ceremony, he dedicated his service award to Nancy, Bernice, Lorna, and Jean, saying they had taught him never to give up on the victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The case led to changes in casino security protocols throughout Kansas and several other states. New regulations required better surveillance systems, mandatory escorts for jackpot winners, and improved cooperation with law enforcement during investigations. The changes came too late for four friends who had simply wanted to enjoy their good fortune, but perhaps they would protect others in the future. Martha Kellerman established a scholarship fund in her mother's name, providing assistance to elderly residents who needed transportation to medical appointments and social activities. The fund was supported by donations from people who had followed the case and been moved by its resolution. Martha often spoke about how her mother would have appreciated knowing that her death had led to help for others in similar circumstances. The families of all four women found different ways to honor their memory and process their grief. Some became advocates for missing persons cases, working with law enforcement to keep investigations active. Others focused on private remembrance, gathering annually on the anniversary of the disappearance to share memories and support each other through the ongoing healing process. Miguel Santos was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, family members were given the opportunity to address the court. Jean Morrison's daughter spoke about her mother's kindness and generosity, noting that Jean would probably have given Santos money if he had, simply asked for help instead of taking it through violence. The statement captured both the senseless nature of the crime and the character of the woman whose life had been taken. Jerry Hoffman, the security technician whose persistence had recovered the crucial footage, received recognition from several law enforcement agencies for his role in solving the case. He used the attention to start a non-profit organization that helps recover digital evidence in cold cases, applying technical skills to provide closure for families who'd been waiting years for answers. The recovered footage was used in law enforcement training programs as an example of how seemingly lost evidence might still exist in unexpected places. The case became a textbook study in the importance of thorough investigation and the value of preserving all potential evidence, even when it initially appears damaged or worthless. In the end, four women who had worked hard throughout their lives, raised families, contributed to their communities, and asked little from the world, were murdered for the contents of an envelope they had won through chance and intended to use for modest improvements to their simple lives. Their story serves as a reminder that evil can emerge from anywhere, targeting the innocent and vulnerable for reasons that make sense only to those who have lost their humanity. But their story also demonstrates that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved through persistence, technological advancement, and the dedication of people who refuse to let victims be forgotten. Nancy Kellerman, Bernice Watson, Lorna Phillips, and Jean Morrison finally found peace, and their families found the answers that had eluded them for nearly 8 years of uncertainty and grief. The case file was officially closed on November 18, 2010, marked solved by confession and physical evidence. But for the families who had lived with questions and heartbreak for so long, the real closure came from knowing that their loved ones were finally at rest and that the truth had emerged from the darkness where it had been hidden for so many years.